Hi, welcome back. This is our second video in which we make some Afghan rice or Kabuli rice.
Yep.
This can be made in a variety of ways, but it combines sweet and savory flavors. So
I'm
you
going to
can
tell them our names.
Okay, go ahead and tell me your name.
Hi, it's Peter. This is my mom, and her name is Damien. This is Ajax, my little brother, and I'm Danny. So today we're doing another video about making Kabuli rice.
Very good job.
Yep.
Okay, so this recipe requires quite a bit of prep compared to some other recipes. Okay, so you're going to take 3 cups of basmati rice, it doesn't matter which brand, and soak it in 4 cups of water for at least an hour before you begin cooking. You also want to set aside 1.5 cups of raisins. You also want to grate 4 or 5 medium to large carrots. You'll get about 2 to 3 cups of grated carrot. I generally use this side of a grater. So the 3 spices we're using in this, in addition to salt and pepper, which you can use to taste, is coriander, cumin, and smoked paprika. Okay, so for the rice proper, we're going to need a teaspoon and a half of coriander, a teaspoon and a half of cumin, and 1 teaspoon of the paprika. And then we're also going to set aside 3/4 of a teaspoon of cumin and coriander and half a teaspoon of the paprika. That's going to season our chicken and our raisins and carrot mix. And we will get to that later. Okay, for our next step, we're going to take our rice over to the stove. Still, again, this is rice, 3 cups of rice with 4 cups of water that is soaked for an hour. We're going to dump it into a large pot, and we're going to bring it to a boil, and then we're going to let it simmer for 5 minutes covered. And we will show you what the rice will probably look like at the end of 5 minutes, so you know what to be looking for in terms of how much water has boiled off and how done the rice is. It certainly won't be ready to eat yet. But we're going to cook it after, again, it's going to come to a boil. We're going to let it simmer for 5 minutes covered, and then we're going to turn it off and remove it from the heat and drain it.
Hi, I'm John, and at this point I'm going to move on to the next step, which is preparing our chicken. To do this step, basically I have a cutting board, our knife, and then I have 8 4-ounce packages of chicken. The important you'll see in this step is when you cut this chicken up, you dice it fairly small so that they're bite-sized when you eat your rice. All right. Okay, now I've removed all 8 pieces of chicken breasts. Just move them off to the side so I can work easily. Work one at a time. And again, I try to cut these to about the size of a penny or a dime each piece. And it doesn't matter which angles you cut them at, but of course you want to cut them fairly evenly so that when you cook them, they'll be consistent in how they're cooked. Okay, our rice is finished boiling and all the water has come off. See, it's fairly dry, but just to make sure that the rice isn't wet, what we do is we take it off the stove and we put it in one of our colanders or our strainers and let the rest of the moisture dry out, or let the rest of the moisture drip out of the bottom. And it doesn't matter if some of this rice stays in this pot, because I'm going to use the same pot with the final cooking step. Okay, for the next step, we finished cutting up all the chicken. What we're going to do now is just cook it ahead of time. Before we put it in the rice, we want to make sure that most of the chicken is cooked fairly thoroughly. So all I've done with this is cut this chicken up. Okay, we put a pat of butter inside our cast iron, and we're going to go ahead and prep that, or cook that chicken. Okay, once that butter's sufficiently melted, that's when I'll go ahead and slide the chicken in. Again, at this point, there's no seasoning or anything on the chicken. Once I've got it into the pan, I will salt it, because as Jamie described earlier, recommend that you salt every ingredient along the way at each step of the cooking process. Alright, again, add some salt, make sure we have flavor. And we'll cook this using a spatula. Just keep it moving because it is cast iron. You don't want to let it burn. Okay, we finished cooking the chicken. Another point I want to point out, the chicken tends to have a lot of moisture in it, especially if you use a lot of butter when you're cooking it. And as I talked about with the rice, it's really important you take the extra moisture out when you cook in the final steps of the process. So I just used a colander to drain out the extra moisture. So the chicken's complete at this point. Another point I want to make is you don't have to cook this meal with chicken. We choose chicken because that's the meat of choice for us and our family. Traditionally, when I was in Afghanistan, this is normally cooked without meat at all or with goat and sometimes lamb. So again, you can use any type of meat you want. It just depends on your taste. Okay, if you remember earlier, Jamie, when she was working with her two helpers, talked about some seasoning mix that she made. So there were two amounts. There was a smaller amount and a large amount. We like to take the smaller amount just to add flavor. We take and put it on our chicken before we mix it into the overall mix. So just basically put it on top and then mix it around. You can use a spatula or something to mix it more deeply. Good to go. Now we're going to start cooking the rest of the ingredients. So using the same cast iron pan, except for this time instead of using butter, I like to use pure canola oil just because it doesn't burn very quickly at high heat. So in this case, because we're cooking quite a bit of carrots, which do absorb a lot of oil, we put a 1/4 cup of oil in there and we're heating it up. And again, very basic. Put the carrots in. Spread them pretty evenly. I want to get them as spread out so that they'll cook evenly as possible. And then, as we talked about earlier, I like to salt in every step. And there's no harm because you're cooking, at least if you're cooking on cast iron, of adding more oil if it seems like the oil is burning off. So again, I'll just keep this moving most of the time and let it cook until it's soft or crunchy, depending on how you like the flavor. It takes about 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes of cooking at a minimum to get it where it's soft. And again, like I said, if you want to go a little bit longer, you can to get it crispy. Okay, we're just about finished with the carrots. In our case, we cooked for about 3.5, 4 minutes. I did have to add a little bit more oil so it didn't dry out too much because unlike the rice, you want to have a little bit of oily or greasiness in your ingredients from here on out. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn off the heat and then we'll switch to the next ingredient. Okay, next we're going to cook your raisins. In this case, you don't need as much oil. For some reason, the raisins, they cook very quickly and don't take as much oil. You already can see we already put the carrots in with the chicken, so all I'm going to do is add the raisins in. And it's really important, probably more important than in any other ingredient that you're cooking, that you keep these moving. Probably need the heat on. And what you'll see as they cook is they'll bubble up or rehydrate as they absorb the oil and the heat. Okay, the raisins have been cooking for about 2 minutes now as the oil heats back up, and as you can see, they're already starting to rehydrate and engulf, or rather enlarge again. I will reiterate, it's important you keep them moving because they will burn if you let them sit for very long on the bottom of this pan. Okay, and once these are done, which they are just about there, I'm going to take and put them in with the other ingredients, and we'll move on to the next step.
Okay, so now we've done a lot of the savory ingredients. We've done some sweet ingredient with the raisins, but the rest of our sweet's going to come from our caramel. We're going to make a simple caramel with 1/3 a cup of sugar. I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of water. We're just going to mix it. It's still going to be cloudy. We're not doing a simple syrup here. We're doing a caramel. Now we're going to cook this over medium to medium high heat, and we're going to watch it like hawks because it's going to start to bubble. And caramels are very finicky. We don't want this to crystallize, and we don't want it to burn, obviously. So we're going to look for a golden to golden brown color before we move on to our next step. Okay, as you can see, our caramel is starting to bubble, but you can see that it's uneven because we have a lot of bubbles in the back and hardly any in the front. So we're going to just adjust this without stirring. It's important not to stir the caramel at all. We're trying to get those bubbles even. Another thing you may want to do is turn it down a bit if you can't seem to get an even boil on it. And just continue to adjust it until the bubbles start to look like they're evenly dispersed throughout the pan. Okay, we can see that this is starting to cook a little bit higher than we would like. And again, we don't want to stir it, but we can give it a little shake to try and disperse some of that sugar. And we can also turn it way down if we'd like. Just again to control the heat so that it doesn't start to crystallize. We want that water to burn off evenly across the pan so that our caramel isn't ruined. Okay, so Jon has shaken this vigorously a couple of times. This is what we want it to look like when it's cooking. See how the bubbles are evenly dispersed and the solution is starting to turn a little bit yellow, which is just what we want. But caramel is very tricky and you're going to have to probably do this a couple of times, but it's only sugar and water, so don't be afraid to dump it out if something doesn't look right or if it's crystallized and it starts to look like rock salt. That's a really bad thing. We want this to remain a liquid, and again, you can cook it at a lower temperature if it seems like it's cooking too quickly or unevenly. The lower you cook it, the more easy it is to fix. Okay, our caramel is still bubbling away here, but once it is finished, it's going to be a very quick process. We're going to move it directly to this trivet immediately once we decide it's the right color. We're going to dump in 1/3 cup of oil right down the center, and then right on top of that oil we're going to dump our large amount of that 3 seasoning mix, and Jon's going to use the swirl method to mix it again. Again, we're not going to use a spoon or anything to mix it. He's going to use that swirl method, and very quickly he's going to move over to the stove where we have our rice that has been drained sitting in the pot that it cooked in. So that rice is sitting there, and we're going to pour that caramel directly on top of it and immediately start stirring it with a spoon. And this is really important because the caramel is going to turn very quickly from a liquid into a solid. And what we want are these little crunchy bits dispersed evenly throughout the rice.
Alright, all I'm doing now is swirling it to make sure I get it relatively homogeneous. It's going to start to solidify, so you don't want to do it too long before you add it to your rice.
What you want to get at the end of this is as little white rice as possible. You want almost all of your rice to have an orange tinge, and you'll see some big chunks of the caramel come out, and that's okay. You can chop them up smaller as you mix in the other ingredients, because now it's time to actually mix in our carrots and our raisins and our chicken as well. Again, you can use mushrooms or no meat at all, just carrots and raisins if you prefer a vegetarian dish. One other thing I'm doing right now is, you'll notice we've got some caramel stuck to our wooden spoon that we use. So I'm going to just scrape it off into the chicken. We don't want to, into the rice. We don't want to miss out on some of those sweet bits in every bite, if possible.
All right.
So Jon is adding the chicken, the raisins, and the carrots. I'm going to stir it one more time to try and incorporate all of these carrots and raisins and chicken into the rice pretty evenly again. And then, once I'm satisfied with that, we are going to put the cover on this pot and cook this at a medium-low temperature for anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes, but no longer than 15. You'll want to stir it periodically during that time, check on it. And then as soon as you're done, you can enjoy it.
Okay, thanks for joining us today. That concludes our dish preparation of Afghan Kabuli rice. And here's what the 2 dishes look like. Thanks very much. See you next time.
I have something to say to them.
Okay.
Everybody, before the day comes, and mom made a pretty picture, and I'm gonna let my brother Ajax talk. Bye. Yeah. So,
What do you want to say? Do you like to eat this rice? Do you like to eat Mom and Daddy's fancy rice?
No. I want to talk about that.
Okay, well, what do you like to talk about?
Mom wants this. Mom, I'm gonna show the and we're gonna put that in this and then rice. And we got to talk to
Oh, yes, we're going to put the seasonings in it. So we have
Mom,
2.
I have to talk
Let's
to
smell
them.
it. Why don't you smell it?
Mom, I have to talk to them.
Do you like the way it smells? No, you don't like the way it smells? How
I
about
have
this
to
one?
talk to them. I have
Oh,
to
that
show them.
smells yummy. Okay. All right, Danny. Last time, and then Mommy has to do a log talk. Okay.
So the kids my strength.
Your strength.
Everybody, I'm gonna show you my strength. Yeah. Watch this.
That's pretty strong, bud.
I can lift up this. I can lift up a hippo
Oh,
or an elephant.
wow. Okay.
And this ingredient is like an instrument.
It is like an instrument.
And this is like a...
Okay, are we ready to talk some more?